Not that I'm even speaking of this.
Hello, morning. No, it's not morning. Good afternoon.
Thanks. Good afternoon, aloha. Welcome to the Hawaii State Capitol, the House of Representatives. Nelson Mandela once said, "There is no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." Members, we have a criminal justice system that has disregarded child status. They've treated our children in the same way as adults, and that's not right. Currently, 2 states have passed laws to address this, California being one and Nevada being another. We have 2 bills that are moving in conference, and we're praying that hopefully we can move them out, House Bill 217 and House Bill 218, to try to make this injustice right. We have the ability to become the 2nd state in the nation for each bill, if we can pass these bills in conference. It's my honor to introduce the champions of this effort. We've got the Chair of Judiciary on the Senate side, Carl Rhodes, who will be speaking first. We've got the Chair of the Judiciary on the House side, Chris Lee, Representative Lee. We've got the Chair of the Human Services and Homelessness Committee, Representative Joy San Buenaventura. We have our good friend who flew in from Washington, D.C., James Dole, Human Rights for Kids. And of course, everyone knows our good friend Kat Brady, Community Alliance on Prisons. I want to thank you for being here, and we're going to turn it over to Senator Carl Rhodes. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Representative Zeno. I'm going to talk just briefly about HB 218. This bill will give judges greater discretion when sentencing children in criminal cases, allowing them to depart up to 50% away from the otherwise applicable mandatory minimums. The way it works right now is basically if you're under 18 and you're indicted for or accused of a crime, you go to family court. But in certain situations, the family court can waive you up to adult court, and then the normal adult rules apply for, I think, entirely, or for the most part at least. What this bill would do is say if you're in that situation where you've been sent up to adult court, the judge can, because the justification for allowing shorter sentences, depending on the circumstances, is that the science indicates that juvenile brains, your brain isn't really developed until you're about 25 years old. Some would argue that only male brains are not really developed. That's the general rule of thumb. And it doesn't really make any sense. And also, the youth tend to be more impressionable. So that cuts both ways. It means they can get themselves in trouble by listening to people that aren't leading them in the right direction. But it also means that they can reform in ways that adults can't. So having a lower mandatory sentences in certain cases, at the judge's discretion, it makes a lot of sense, because you don't want these guys, you don't want these people in prison with hardened criminals who are going to be their role models, basically. And so this bill would make it so that judges can have more discretion and not treat somebody who's not, so allow to treat juveniles as juveniles, not as adults. So I will stop there and turn it over to the next person who I think was, I don't remember.
Yes, the Chair of Judiciary on the House side, Representative Chris Lee.
Good morning, afternoon. I think following in line with what Representative Rhodes was speaking about, it's clear that in a great number of cases, minors who have been exonerated for crimes that they had previously been convicted of committing, turns out that they had actually confessed to those crimes, because at the time, in many cases, they didn't understand the legal process, they didn't have access to counsel and to good, sound legal advice. And so House Bill 217, which we're also moving, would require that for anyone under 16, there be access to counsel, access to good advice, sound legal advice prior to waiving any constitutional rights and putting themselves in jeopardy. Because frequently we want to make sure that these abuses aren't repeated. And this is something that I think is a good first step toward ensuring that people are not convicted without due process.
Thank you. Next up, we've got the Chair of Human Services and Homelessness on the House side, Representative Joyce Sandpoint of Ventura.
Okay, thank you very much. And as previous speakers have said, these bills basically take into account the fact of that children are far more impressionable, far more swayed to do bad things if the circumstances were such that they are put in those situations. So hopefully by passing these bills, we have judges, we give the judges the discretionary and the tools. And I just want to have the public know that one of these bills are specifically for non-violent crimes. So it also goes to reducing and requiring that whoever is incarcerated are for those people who really need to be incarcerated. And so this goes towards justice reform. And it is, having done juvenile work as a practicing attorney before I became a legislator, I know that it's a rare instance already when minors are waived off into the adult courts. But we want to make sure that when they do, that the judges are given the tools to take into account their age. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And of course, next up, we've got Pat Brady of the Community Alliance on Prisons.
Aloha. Well, we all know kids are really impressionable, very subject to peer pressure, but we also know that kids are really amenable to rehabilitation, and this is what we're pushing. You know, in Hawaii, we had a disproportionate number of Native Hawaiian kids who ended up in HYCF, Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility. Luckily, that number has been drastically released, but we want people to understand that kids are very amenable to rehabilitation, that we don't want to put kids in an adult system where they're basically sent to criminal college. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we've got James Dole. He represents Human Rights for Kids. He flew in from Washington, D.C. He's actually been the rock for these two bills. So, James, if you can just enlighten us.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Representative Mizuno, and to the chairs who joined us here, and for your incredible leadership in shepherding these bills through this process. I'm James Dole. I'm the president and founder of Human Rights for Kids, which is based in Washington, D.C. Human Rights for Kids is dedicated to the promotion and protection of the human rights of children, particularly children in the criminal justice system. As Rep. Mizuno said, we've been so quick to discard child status in the United States and treat children as if they were adults when they commit crimes. And we're one of the only developed nations in the world where this actually happens. And this is a theme that really began back in the late 1980s and early 1990s when there was a juvenile crime wave that happened. And there was a group of criminologists that had theorized that there was a new group of super predator children who were coming of age, who were more violent and less remorseful than ever before. These children were characterized as being godless, jobless, and fatherless, and state legislatures across the country were urged to pass laws making it easier to transfer children into the adult criminal justice system. At the same time that this was happening, we saw with the advent of the 1994 Omnibus Crime Control Bill, states urged to pass truth in sentencing laws that drastically increased the use of mandatory minimum sentences, including on child offenders. What this meant was that for any child who was transferred into the adult criminal justice system, they were now facing severe consequences, severe mandatory minimums. And upwards of over 200,000 children each year are initially started and tried in the adult criminal justice system, exposing them to these harsh mandatory minimum sentences. Everyone's familiar that with President Trump's recent signing of the First Step Act, there's been a lot of talk across the nation about criminal justice reform. Unfortunately, too often we've left out in that conversation the most vulnerable casualties of mass incarceration, and that is children. Children disproportionately have been sentenced to these lengthy prison sentences, oftentimes longer than adults, even if they commit the same crime. Part of the reason for that is because children aren't adept. They don't understand their constitutional rights. They don't understand how the criminal justice system works. And of course they wouldn't, because the criminal justice system was never designed with them in mind. Last year, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights released a scathing report of the United States' continued treatment of children in the criminal justice system. Under international human rights law and human rights norms, every state is required to have special proceedings that at every stage of the criminal justice process considers child status and takes child status into account. Too often we've neglected our obligations under international human rights law when it comes to children in the justice system. And this is an aberration in our law, only in the criminal justice system. We talked earlier about the juvenile brain and behavioral development science that shows that there are fundamental differences between juvenile and adult brains. It's the reason why we don't let kids vote, serve in the military, enter into contracts, they can't get married. In every aspect of our society, we treat children differently, except when they commit a crime. At that point, we discard the fact that they are children, and we're easily disposable into the criminal justice system, where we don't even really care what happens to them. We lose track of them. We don't even know in this country how many children across the nation have been prosecuted and are currently incarcerated for crimes that they committed as children. There's no broader violation of human rights than the way that we have treated children in this country. And we're very proud to stand alongside Representative Mizuno and the Hawaii legislature in finally addressing this issue. Hawaii is leading the nation once again in making sure that we're taking into account child status and protecting the human rights of our children. And other folks around the country have taken note. Similar legislation has already been introduced in this state legislative cycle. And actually one of Representative Mizuno's bills, House Bill 218, has also been introduced in Congress by Congressman Bruce Westerman. He's a Republican from the 4th Congressional District of Arkansas. It's a very conservative district, which highlights the bipartisan nature of these issues and the need for Democrats and Republicans alike to come together and work to address this terrible human rights abuse. So we're glad to be here. We look forward to these bills becoming law. And again, hats off to the legislature here in Hawaii for being one of the first states to address this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this time, we'll be taking questions. So again, these are the champions, the chairs that will be going over the bills as they're set for conference. And of course, we've got both James and Kat Brady here. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. Questions?
We did a good job. Thank you very much.
Do you have any estimates for how many juveniles in Hawaii might be affected by these bills?
You would know that, yeah.
Luckily, we have a very small number of kids, a handful of kids, that are actually waived these days because of the reforms we made several years ago in the juvenile justice system. So thanks to Judge Browning, who was one of our champions when he was the head of family court. So it's not a lot of kids, but even one child is too many.
Excuse me. So the bill that gives the right to counsel, of course, that will encompass a lot more kids, right, upon arrest. It's the sentencing part, the waiver. Like, as it is now, as Kat Brady said, it's already a rare occurrence. So this is going to be even more rare. Thank you.
Right to counsel, I guess that would affect any child.
Any child who gets arrested would have a right to counsel now.
Sorry, and currently they don't?
No, because they're not adults. And what happens normally is the police the police will call the parent or the guardian in, and that's their counsel. Thank you.
Chair Sanguineventura answered that as perfect as can be. I'm a minor, and yet I'm being interrogated, and I don't have a right to counsel. That's clear discrimination. But if I was an adult, I would have a right to counsel. Excellent answer. And again, California had passed House Bill 217, Nevada 218. Those are the only two states. So hopefully we can become the second state in the nation in passing 217 and House Bill 218. This is cutting edge. This is pretty big stuff for all of us. But again, thank you, and again, any other questions, please feel free to ask, and we'll get you an answer. Yes.
Let me clarify that. So Miranda versus Arizona, basically, you folks see that in the movies all the time, right? They give you your rights to counsel as well as the right to remain silent, etc. So this bill basically requires the police to give them their Miranda rights, okay, at a time of arrest. Versus, so they do have a right to counsel when the police arrest them and parents are called in. Parents have a right to hire counsel, but because it isn't a right to counsel, they don't have a right to like a public defender at the time, or, okay? And they don't have their Miranda rights. They don't know what their rights are at the time.
I just wanted to add, these are kids who are 16 and under. I mean, really scary when you're arrested and you're in a room and you feel pressured. And there's been so many cases of kids who've been for hours of interrogation, finally just saying, all right, I did it. You know, the case of the Central Park 5 is really glaring. You know, 5 kids who were accused of raping a jogger. And these kids they served their full terms, and then they were exonerated because their rights were totally abridged. This is really about human rights, and it's the right of a kid to ask for counsel. Sometimes when they call their parents don't know much about the system. So it's really important that they have contact with somebody who can help them understand what's happening and what their rights are.
And just to add a little bit to that, the New York Times recently profiled a piece of a case involving a young man by the name of Mr. Hugh Burton. Mr. Hugh Burton was a 16-year-old kid who falsely confessed to killing his mother and spent over 20 years in prison. He's been out now, and he's been raising awareness about this issue of false confessions of children. The National Exoneration Registry that's run by the University of Michigan highlights these stark numbers even more. When we look at 14 and 15-year-old children who are later exonerated of crimes that they did not commit, over 60% of them falsely confess to those crimes. When we look at kids that are under the age of 14, nearly all of them did, right? So that gives us a good indication of the fact that when we're talking about children, number one, they don't understand their rights under Miranda v. Arizona. Most adults don't really understand their rights, right? Yet we're expecting young children to understand what they're giving up and what they're waiving, and the truth is that they don't. And the U.S. Supreme Court actually called attention to this issue in a case called JDB versus North Carolina in 2012. And I'm going to read just a quick passage of that. And the court in that case said, "The pressure of custodial interrogation is so immense that it can induce a frighteningly high percentage of people to confess to crimes they never committed." And so, again, House Bill 217 is really about making sure that kids have the ability to consult with counsel and understand their rights before they waive them. It's a very modest bill in that sense, and it's trying to protect children from the instances and the injustices of that, like Mr. Hugh Burton suffered, so that they won't have to spend time in prison for crimes that they did not commit.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think I wanted to let both judiciary chairs chime in before we close this. So Senator Rhodes, followed by Representative Lee, would you mind?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, you know, there's slight differences in the two bills. Of course, that's why we have a conference committee to work out the differences between the House and Senate versions. But in a sense, the bill that requires it talks about the Miranda part of it, goes a little farther than Miranda. It says that the child actually has to talk to somebody. They can't just have the rights read to them and then waive them on their own. They have to talk to somebody. In the Senate version, it was parent, guardian, or legal counsel. I think in the House version, it's just legal counsel. You still can't, they could still, my understanding is the way it would work is they could still waive their rights after they've talked to legal counsel or to their guardian or parent. But it is a little bit of a step beyond what we would do for adults in a Miranda situation. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I just close out by saying that this year, the legislature is taking significant steps to reform the criminal justice system to ensure a more fair and just process for everyone, whether you're an adult, and especially in this case, if you're a minor, to make sure that you don't find yourself in a situation where you are incriminating yourself, being coerced into making false confessions, and ultimately being taken advantage of by a legal system which is not designed to provide you the same rights as adults. And that's really what these bills are trying to address.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thanks,
your
guys.